Okay, so he then crosses the Rubicon, which was the standard. That was the essentially that was the river in northern Italy that Roman generals had to stop there if they brought their army into Rome. Crossing the Rubicon, they were in open rebellion. So Caesar famously says, as he crosses the Rubicon, the die is cast, meaning it's a gambler's term. You're basically rolling the dice, you're taking your chances. So he's essentially, after crossing the Rubicon, in open rebellion against the Roman Republic. So at this time, though, the first triumvirate has essentially broken apart. Marcus Crassus the Rich, essentially, he dies on a military campaign against the Parthians, the Persians at that time. Pompey's wife, Julia, Caesar's daughter, has unfortunately passed away. Their relationship breaks down. And so the Senate turns to Pompey as a counterweight to Caesar. Pompey takes the treasury with him and goes to Spain to get soldiers that had served with him in other parts, like in Palestine and then goes to Greece. Caesar, that's where he meets up with Pompey, and a battle ensues in Greece called the Battle of Pharsalus. All right. Now here, Pompey actually outnumbers Caesar's 2-1, but Caesar's forces are essentially they're like a juggernaut. They're a well-oiled machine at this point. They've been fighting in Gaul for about 10 years. All right, and so he defeats Pompey, who's essentially kind of retired, if you will. All right, Pompey flees Greece, decides that he's going to head to Egypt. Same thing, to maybe garner some troops. Egypt is being controlled by the Ptolemies, right? We had talked about. There was one of his deputies is in Egypt, in Alexandria, serving the pharaoh there in a military capacity, thinking that he can garner a military, but he's mistaken. The Egyptian pharaoh at that time is basically convinced that a kind of a battle here with the Roman Civil War would be kind of bad for the Ptolemies. So they end up having Pompey killed, and they have him beheaded. So when Caesar makes his way to Alexandria, he is offered the head of Pompey. He acts all very appalled by this, but he basically feels, he's relieved that he doesn't have to kill him. While he's in Egypt, he famously has a relationship with Cleopatra VII. At this time, Cleopatra is exiled from the throne. Her brother, who she's also married to, has her exiled. Caesar helps restore her to the throne. They have a child, a son by the name of Caesarion. All right, and so word gets back to Rome that Caesar has basically kind of defeated Pompey, and that he is the undisputed kind of power in Rome. On his way back to Rome, he stops off in Asia Minor. He fights. He gets his battle called the Battle of Zela with a state called Pontus. There, he famously has the quote, "Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered." He is awarded a triumph, which is this big parade in Rome, in which at the end the Gaelic chieftain Vercingetorix is going to be executed. He's basically kind of painted in kind of like vermilion and has this big chariot in which there's a kind of phallic symbol behind him, so talking about his virility. All the while, there's a slave kind of whispering in his ear, "Remember, you're just a man." But when it's hard to kind of take in when the fact that he is the undisputed kind of power in Rome. In 44, the Senate appoints him the title dictator, which is generally for only people for during periods of kind of like civil war or during kind of social strife. He's given that position for 10 years, and then he later changes the title for it's either dictator for life or dictator in perpetuity without real end, if you will. All right, so that's going to kind of cause some problems for particularly some senators here. All right. However, this is the deal: is that he does get a lot of stuff done as dictator. All right. One thing is that he tries to kind of consolidate and create a kind of a number of supporters here. So he grants Roman citizenship to people outside of Italy, primarily in Gaul. From these various Gaelic tribes that had fought alongside the Romans and auxiliary forces. This is where we start to see the kind of the idea of being Roman, not necessarily based on ethnicity per se, but on kind of citizenship, right? Kind of like being an American in that sense. Then to get support in the Senate, which most of the senators had sided with Pompey, And he basically kind of, while some of them were kind of killed in the battle at Pharsalus, and that there was a number of them that were pardoned. He understands that the original senators of 300 are not big supporters, so he triples the size of the Senate, many of them coming from Gaul and places like that, to about 900 to ensure that he can get things like kind of through without much interference and kind of create a kind of a majority there. And then we were talking about the Gracchi yesterday. He takes straight out of the Gracchi playbook the concept of redistributing land. Also, basically, those who had those latifundias had to substitute at least a third of their labor with kind of wage earners from slave labor. This is, like I said, this is straight from the Gracchi, and so that's kind of appealing to the masses, if you will. All right, you guys got this? Got to keep it moving. All right. And then he builds has public works projects built, which is anything from the construction of temples to bridges, theaters, stuff like that. Imposes tariffs on to help Italian industries like pottery and wine from other places like Gaul and that. And then the big thing, he replaces the calendar, which can be somewhat confusing in Rome, from a kind of a lunar calendar to a solar calendar with 365 days. And then every 4 years, you add an extra day. That's how we get leap year. All right. Yeah. And the month of Quintilis was renamed in his honor, which becomes July. All right. So there's a lot of stuff that he gets done, right? That within this kind of short period of time, mainly because he has kind of stacked the Senate with kind of supporters of his and kind of with that kind of gain, given others kind of citizenship and such. And he's very popular with the masses. He's very popular with the proletariat. However, like I said, he is not popular with a number of senators. All right. And then you guys, sophomore year, those of you guys who are seniors, sophomore year, you guys in English class read the play Julius Caesar, so I'm not really giving up too much stuff, but I'm going to play this TED Ed video that talks about the conspiracy against Caesar that eventually leads to his death.
What would you do if you thought your country was on the path to tyranny? If you saw one man gaining too much power, would you try to stop him? Even if that man was one of your closest friends and allies? These were the questions haunting Roman Senator Marcus Junius Brutus in 44 B.C.E., the year Julius Caesar would be assassinated. Opposing unchecked power wasn't just a political matter for Brutus, it was a personal one. He claimed descent from Lucius Junius Brutus, who had helped overthrow the tyrannical king known as Tarquin the Proud. Instead of seizing power himself, the elder Brutus led the people in a rousing oath to never again allow a king to rule. Rome became a republic based on the principle that no one man should hold too much power. Now, 4.5 centuries later, this principle was threatened. Julius Caesar's rise to the powerful position of consul had been dramatic. Years of military triumphs had made him the wealthiest man in Rome, and after defeating his rival Pompey the Great in a bitter civil war, his power was at its peak. His victories and initiatives, such as distributing lands to the poor, had made him popular with the public, and many senators vied for his favor by showering him with honors. Statues were built, temples were dedicated, and a whole month was renamed, still called July today. More importantly, the title of dictator, meant to grant temporary emergency powers in wartime, had been bestowed upon Caesar several times in succession. And in 44 BCE, he was made dictator perpetuo, dictator for a potentially unlimited term. All of this was too much for the senators who feared a return to the monarchy their ancestors had fought to abolish, as well as those whose own power and ambition were impeded by Caesar's rule. A group of conspirators calling themselves the Liberators began to secretly discuss plans for assassination. Leading them were the senator Gaius Cassius Longinus and his friend and brother-in-law, Brutus. Joining the conspiracy was not an easy choice for Brutus. Even though Brutus had sided with Pompey in the ill-fated civil war, Caesar had personally intervened to save his life, not only pardoning him, but even accepting him as a close advisor and elevating him to important posts. Brutus was hesitant to conspire against the man who had treated him like a son, but in the end, Cassius's insistence and Brutus's own fear of Caesar's ambitions won out. The moment they had been waiting for came on March 15th. At a Senate meeting held shortly before Caesar was to depart on his next military campaign, as many as 60 conspirators surrounded him, unsheathing daggers from their togas and stabbing at him from all sides. As the story goes, Caesar struggled fiercely until he saw Brutus. Despite the famous line "Et tu, Brute," written by Shakespeare, we don't know Caesar's actual dying words. Some ancient sources claim he said nothing, while others record the phrase, "And you, child?" fueling speculation that Brutus may have actually been Caesar's illegitimate son. But all agree that when Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he covered his face and gave up the fight, falling to the ground after being stabbed 23 times. Unfortunately for Brutus, he and the other conspirators had underestimated Caesar's popularity among the Roman public, many of whom saw him as an effective leader, and the Senate as a corrupt aristocracy. Within moments of Caesar's assassination, Rome was in a state of panic. Most of the other senators had fled, while the assassins barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill. Mark Antony, Caesar's friend and co-consul, was swift to seize the upper hand, delivering a passionate speech at Caesar's funeral days later that whipped the crowd into a frenzy of grief and anger. As a result, the liberators were forced out of Rome. The ensuing power vacuum led to a series of civil wars, during which Brutus, facing certain defeat, took his own life. Ironically, the ultimate result would be the opposite of what the conspirators had hoped to accomplish: the end of the Republic and the concentration of power under the office of emperor. Opinions over the assassination of Caesar were divided from the start, and have remained so. As for Brutus himself, few historical figures have inspired such a conflicting legacy. In Dante's Inferno, he was placed in the very center of hell and eternally chewed by Satan himself for his crime of betrayal. But Swift's Gulliver's Travels described him as one of the most virtuous and benevolent people to have lived. The interpretation of Brutus as either a selfless fighter against dictatorship or an opportunistic traitor has shifted with the tides of history and politics. But even today, over 2,000 years later, questions about the price of liberty, the conflict between personal loyalties and universal ideals, and
Okay, so, all right, keep it moving here. So probably the one of the more famous dates in world history, March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March. Essentially, Caesar is attending a meeting of the Senate, not in the Senate. The Curia is being kind of reconstructed there, but at the theater of his one-time ally, son-in-law, and later adversary, Pompey. And so, according to the legend there, he's greeted by 60 senators who are basically kind of armed here. He's stabbed 23 times. The guy that he's sometimes credited as the leader, but really Cassius was probably more of the leader, but does give the final death blow is Marcus Junius Brutus, who this was not just a coincidence. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, was the one who basically established the Republic by overthrowing the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud. And Caesar is definitely kind of has this appearance of a king. So the liberators thought they would be basically celebrated for basically saving the Republic. However, they miscalculated, to say the least. All right. So this here is the statue of Brutus. A later portrait painted in the 1800s shows him being assassinated. There, right up here, is the statue of Pompey. Now, it shows him in this painting kind of wearing orange. Historians claim that he actually showed up to this meeting rocking a purple robe, which again is somewhat kind of scandalous in the sense that that basically is telling everybody that he's operating as an emperor or a king, right? So any of the co-conspirators that were on the fence, after they saw him rocking that purple, that was probably out the window there. They basically were all in it. For some reason, the state seal of Virginia has this played out here, all right? And underneath it here in Latin, it says Sic Semper Tyrannis, which loosely is thus always to tyrants. In American history, this is what John Wilkes Booth shouted after he jumped on stage after shooting Abraham Lincoln, killing Abraham Lincoln. The Booth family was well aware of the legend of Marcus Junius Brutus. Matter of fact, Booth's father, who was also an actor, his name was Marcus Junius Booth. All right, so it'd be like kind of like in that sense if like Brad Pitt killed the president. All right, and so what we see here is that the conspirators, like I said, miscalculated. At his funeral, at Caesar's funeral in Rome, Mark Antony, his deputy and at one point co-consul, essentially basically gives a eulogy in which he says, you know, Brutus is an honorable man, and then he goes into outline how Brutus and Cassius are not exactly honorable, and gets the crowd caught up in a frenzy. Many of the liberators had to flee Rome, most of them going to Greece, like Brutus and Cassius. And so Mark Antony is like kind of his goal is to say basically take over the army of Caesar and basically kind of hunt down those who were responsible for killing Caesar. However, and this is Mark Antony's bust. However, there was a little bit of a problem here, right? Caesar's will and testament was publicly read, and Mark Antony was not the heir to that, as he thought, because Caesar does not have a son. But he adopted his nephew, his great nephew, Gaius Octavius, as his heir. So what this does is divides the loyalty of Caesar's troops between Mark Antony, which many of them fought with, and Octavius, who was 18 years old at this time. And so at one point, there's a skirmish between the two and their armies, and surprisingly, Octavius wins. All right, and so what ends up happening here is that Antony comes to an agreement with Octavius, and publicly they create the Second Triumvirate, which was between Antony, Octavius, and then another deputy that served with Caesar, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. All right, so they were basically serving as kind of like three dictators, and they each kind of took part of the kind of Roman provinces. And ultimately, their goal was to essentially basically punish the liberators, if you will. So after the establishment of the Second Triumvirate, like I said, it's a little bit different than the First Republic. There was these gold aureas, these coins that were kind of minted. On one side, you had Mark Antony's image, and then on the other side, you had Octavius's image. So you could definitely see the difference between the two physically with that. All right. And then the kind of geography of that was Lepidus controlled Hispania, Spain, into kind of southern parts of Gaul. Mark Antony gets Gaul, Swiss Alpine Gaul. Octavius is kind of control here in North Africa. Italy was supposed to be kind of controlled by all three of them. And in the east here is Brutus and Cassius and the liberators. Down here is the Ptolemaic dynasty. And then Sicily, there was actually Pompey's son, Sextus Pompey, had a kind of a force there in Sicily. So the kind of battle that everybody kind of talks about is considered like the kind of the end of the kind of the liberators. Another battle like Pharsalus takes place in Greece, and that's the Battle of Philippi. At the Battle of Philippi, the combined forces of Brutus and Cassius were defeated by Antony, and at this time, Octavius goes by the name of Octavian, which signifies his kind of maturity. Lepidus is somewhat relegated to the side a little bit here on that. So it's essentially a 2-day battle, and Brutus ends up at the end ends up taking his life. All right, and then other senators are handled in North Africa and Spain. Even those that weren't directly involved, like Cicero, Mark Antony, who Cicero was particularly would talk about, he would talk a lot of smack on Mark Antony. Cicero was killed at Antony's insistence, and then his tongue was cut out and basically nailed to the forum. All right. So what we have here is essentially a new breakdown geographically. Octavian gets the western half. Mark Antony gets the eastern half, which tend to be the more wealthiest. Lepidus has controlled North Africa, but essentially he's kind of sidelined here. And so it's mainly people talk about Octavian and Mark Antony. All right, jealousy and kind of like ambition lead to them kind of having some some disputes here. To kind of bring them back together, Antony agrees to marry Octavian's sister Octavia. However, Soon after that, he engages in a relationship with Cleopatra after meeting her in Syria, and eventually he has a couple children with her. He publicly acknowledges her children. Then Octavian gets a copy of his will, which basically states that Antony wants to be buried in Alexandria. Octavian takes this to the Senate and basically says the guy has lost his marbles. He was declared an enemy of the state. And the Senate puts their support behind Octavian, and another battle, this time a naval battle in Greece, ensues. All right, and this is the Battle of Actium. All right, and in Actium here, Octavian, with the help of his general Agrippa, defeat the combined forces of Antony and the Ptolemaic military of Cleopatra. This was a little bit scandalous in the fact that Cleopatra actually was there at the battle, which the Romans thought that Mark Antony's troops thought that was a little odd. At one point, she flees, and Antony follows her, and so his men essentially surrender. All right, Antony goes to Egypt, and this is a portrait in the 1600s of the battle here. And then Antony heads back to Alexandria, where he knows that the writing's on the wall. He ends up taking his life. Octavian follows him there, and Cleopatra is negotiating with Octavian, talking about how much she loves Caesar and all this other stuff. And Octavian says, we can talk about this back in Rome. Well, she knows that means that he's going to basically take her back to Rome and parade her in a triumph and have her executed. So then she famously commits suicide. That ends the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt becomes a Roman province. Augustus heads back to the Senate. Basically says, I'm a first among equals, which they know is not true. And he ends up basically getting a couple new titles. One is Augustus, which means the exalted one, right, which he goes by. And then the later is Imperator, which basically means emperor. So he's the first emperor of Rome. So this basically transitions us from republic to empire. All right. And so that's what I'll start talking about when we get into the next semester. I'll start with the age of Augustus. Okay. You guys cool with that?
Yep.
Sorry, I was kind of rushing through all this stuff. It's kind of a lot to kind of get in with a short period of time. All right. So Monday, I'll send out a worksheet. It's a map on one side and a primary source on the other. And then, like I said, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm going to leave Google Meets open for just like some questions and stuff like that, but I'm not going to give any notes. And if you need to make up assignments, I highly encourage you to do so. All right. Sound good? Everybody have a good weekend, okay?
You have a good weekend.